Hello everyone, this is Professor Casey. Today we're discussing Chapter 30 from David Emory Shi's America, A Narrative History. This chapter deals specifically with the new protest movements of the 1960s leading into the 1970s. Okay, so this is all of the social uprisings that end up occurring during this time period, and really what end up making the 1960s in particular such a decade of social strife. Okay, this is kind of the outpouring of individuals who are fed up with being marginalized for one reason or another, and kind of how they end up handling the situation. So by the 1960s, now that we've gotten past the Kennedy era and we're well into the era of Lyndon Johnson, the baby boomer generation that has grown up since the end of World War II is now getting into a much more politicized sphere. Okay, they're no longer complacent with the ideas of social injustice, of inequality, and so forth. And especially now that the civil rights movement has really hit a head. Okay, we haven't quite gotten yet to the assassination of Martin Luther King or Robert Kennedy or any of the major assassinations from the end of the 1960s. But by this point, though, the Vietnam War has been in full swing for quite a while. And most of the social justice movements of the 1960s are finally beginning to kind of reach a boiling point. By the 1970, it's estimated that over half of Americans are under the age of 30, and 8 million of them are attending college at this point. Okay, and colleges tend to be kind of the origin point for most of the social justice movements of the 1960s and 70s. And by that particular virtue, from 1945 until 1970, the enrollment numbers in colleges and universities all across the country ends up quadrupling. Okay, so more and more people are going to college, and more of the colleges are now becoming liberal arts universities more so than anything else. And again, these are kind of the breeding grounds for most of these social justice movements. And the universities themselves, the ones that don't always focus on, liberal arts and so forth, tend to be dependent on research contracts from corporations and sponsorship from the federal government as well. Okay, so a lot of the major universities, Columbia, Cornell, Kent State, right? A lot of these big universities that start to make really big names for themselves in the 1960s end up gaining a lot of contracts specifically from the government to begin to sponsor, right, what we now call the STEM programs, right, the science, technology, electronics, and mathematics. Okay, so they're getting a lot of the direct sponsorship directly from the government. Okay, the government is funding a lot of the university's activities. And some people end up referring to them as multiversities, okay, because they end up seeming like the universities themselves are almost in league with the government in one form or another, in what people begin to refer to as the military-industrial complex. Okay, this is where the federal government is providing grants to universities and to corporations in exchange for them to, start punching out these new forms of technology and new research and stuff that can then be inserted back into the government. Okay, so it ends up being kind of this symbiotic relationship that is very, very politically driven. And college students at this point in time end up kind of falling into two factions when they do become radicalized. Okay, not everybody ends up, falling into one of these two categories, but when it comes to, new extremist categories, there's two that they end up, going into one direction or another. One is called the New Left, which we'll discuss here in a moment, and the other, and the more famous one, is the Counterculture movement. Okay, so we'll discuss both of those things here in the next few slides. Now, the New Left movement begins in the year 1960, so we have to kind of rewind the clock back a little bit. In 1962, college students at the University of Michigan named Tom Hayden and Alan Haber end up forming what is called the Students for Democratic Society, or SDS. Okay, this is Hayden and Haber here. And this particular movement is something that is considered an organization that is heavily influenced by the civil rights movement. It's something where students are basically trying to focus more and more on social injustice, try to remove it, and try to create a much more democratic society in the United States. 2 years later, these guys call a meeting in Port Huron, Michigan, and they have 60 activists who show up to sign a petition that is called the Port Huron Statement. Okay? And the whole idea here is to try some kind of a grassroots movement to inject more democracy into the United States. Okay? They start to realize that the civil rights movement is starting to stall a little bit, right? There's a little bit of, there's a lot of social pushback here, okay? And they're trying to basically say that, there are tons of marginalized individuals all over the country whose voices are not being heard, right? And we need to find a way to kind of foster the ability for them to be able to be heard. And most of the participants who are involved in this, most of the activists themselves, are either children of individuals who are former leftists in the government, right? They tend to be on the more progressive side of things, and or the children of communists. Okay, and remember, this is still only about a decade or so removed from the witch hunts of the 1950s when McCarthyism was at an all-time high, and so a lot of people are still worried that communism is going to gain a foothold here. So the Port Huron Statement itself is something where, again, all these activists are saying that they need more political reforms in the United States. Racial equality is a big portion of it, okay, because we have the civil rights movement that's going on, and not necessarily just for African Americans too, right? This is also the beginning of the period where more ethnic groups are coming forward and saying that we are also being marginalized, okay? Specifically, the Hispanic movement, and the American Indian movement as well. Okay, so we'll talk about both of those movements too. And also the idea of workers' rights. Okay, so the Port Huron Statement is still very leftist in this idea that we need to, grant more equal rights for workers, specifically when it comes to organized labor, and by extension, although that's not really considered a major part of this, women are also part of this marginalized group with regard to workers' rights. And this movement under Hayden and Haber is referred to as the New Left, okay? And really it's called the New Left only because this is supposed to be a distinction between this movement and the movement of the 1920s, okay? We had a leftist movement in the face of, Christian fundamentalism and all that, where people were beginning to become more secularized. The modernist movement was kind of in full swing. So this New Left is, it's just a different, a major distinction between the 1920s and the 1960s. Okay? So it's the more politicized version of extremism of some kind. Okay? And the SDS group ends up growing into over 100 or over 1,000 different chapters on college campuses all over the country. So there's a presence on most major university campuses all over the place. 1964, UC Berkeley begins to see a major explosion of New Left movement on the campus itself. For one thing, it gets to the point where the university chancellor ends up trying to even outlaw campus protests, okay, saying that, we're going to call the police in if you try to do this anymore. And the students end up protesting that by staging a 32-hour sit-in, okay, and it ends up causing the administration to ultimately cave in and even backpedal on outlawing campus protests. Okay, and this is an extension of something that's called the free speech movement, right? Where basically students, college students in particular, begin to stage these large-scale protests and sit-ins, occupying campus buildings and so forth, occupying administration buildings, basically so that their voice can be heard. Okay? And Mario Savio becomes the leader of this free speech movement during the 1960s. Okay, he ends up leading a lot of major protests, specifically at UC Berkeley, but also scattered all over other places across the country. Now, once we get to 1965, things start to change a little bit, primarily because the war in Vietnam is now beginning to escalate much more. Okay, Lyndon Johnson, as president, begins to be the very first president involved in Vietnam who actually orders the implementation of ground troops. Okay, so up until now, the U.S. has tried to maintain a very distanced position in Vietnam, trying to say, we're going to provide these quote-unquote military advisors, right? Under Eisenhower and under Kennedy, we had several U.S. troops who were being sent in to essentially train Vietnamese soldiers, the South Vietnamese soldiers, that is, to fight against the Viet Cong and the Viet Minh. But now we're actually beginning to send U.S. soldiers for the very first time. Okay, and by extension of that, the government also begins to institute a military draft. Okay, and of course, the primary age group that's being targeted for this are college students. Okay, so this group of politicized college students now who are causing so many problems could very easily be targeted by the government for drafting to be sent off to fight. Okay, so there's millions of college students now who end up facing this. And there's all kinds of particular issues that students themselves could end up facing. Okay, most students are able actually to postpone the need to serve in the military until either they graduate or by the time they turn 24, okay, whichever comes first. So there is a potential to do that if you can maintain good grades. Okay, if you're a C student or lower and you're not maintaining good grades, your number could very easily come up sooner. Okay, for one reason or another, either actively or by sheer coincidence, quote unquote, you could be drafted very quickly. Unfortunately, too, there is plenty of institutionalized racism that goes along with this as well. So if you are African American, if you are Hispanic, you are nearly twice as likely to be drafted as if you were a white student. Okay, so there's tons and tons of factors that are involved in this. It's estimated, too, that about 200,000 young men end up actually ignoring their draft notices altogether, and about 4,000 of them are actually imprisoned for this. Okay, you can be imprisoned for being a draft dodger, essentially. And there's all kinds of ways that people try to beat this. Okay, you can try to be a conscientious objector. Okay, a conscientious objector is basically where you have to go through a long drawn out process of proving somehow that you're not qualified to serve in the military, okay, on religious grounds, moral or ethical beliefs. And it seems like it would be very easy to just say, I don't believe in war, and you would not have to serve. But you have to provide some sort of basically like an official documentation of some kind. Okay, so for instance, if you belong to a religious sect like the Quakers, okay, who are ostensibly pacifists or something like that, you would have to get an elder or a deacon or somebody in your church to sign a document saying that you qualify for conscientious objector status. Okay? So about 56,000 of these young men who end up qualifying for service end up filing for this, and they don't have to serve in armed conflict. They're put into either a non-combatant status or they do some kind of service here at home. And the most popular way for people to avoid the draft is to try to flunk the physical examination. Okay, come up with some kind of a medical excuse to get out of serving. Okay, and a lot of young men actually end up engaging in self-harm in some cases to get out of doing this, right? They will actually shoot themselves in the foot. They will, they'll cut themselves. They'll, make themselves sick in some cases. Sometimes they'll try to prove that they are mentally unfit, right? They'll try to qualify for a Section 8 discharge where they try to prove that they're insane or something along those lines. So there's all kinds of ways of doing this. And again, sometimes you can just get a doctor's note essentially saying that you are not fit to serve. Okay, so there's all kinds of ways to avoid this. But flunking the physical examination is the most common way that young men do this. Some people end up even fleeing across the state lines or fleeing across country lines. Okay, some young men go up to Canada, some flee south to Mexico. There's all kinds of ways that people try to avoid this. And between 1967 and 1968, a lot of the anti-war protests, now that the public opinion on Vietnam has begun to really turn against the war, these protests become more and more violent, okay, because now we not only have that, but in many cases these anti-war protests get combined with these anti-racism riots that we start to see in inner cities, okay. So in places like Cleveland, Detroit, Newark, New Jersey, right, there's all kinds of these major protests against racial discrimination when it comes to employment, when it comes to government housing projects that have been neglected, crime, and so forth. All these start to really erupt into much more physical confrontations. And by 1968, there's a major contingency of SDS students who are led by a young man named Mark Rudd, who you see here. They and a group of black militants at Columbia University began to occupy buildings on a regular basis, okay? And it grounds the university to a complete halt, Okay, the administration building is actually taken over by the students and renamed Malcolm X Hall. And it leads to the classes being canceled. Police end up being called in. There's 700 young people who are arrested, over 100 are injured, and the leaders are all expelled from the university, as you can imagine. Okay, so this image that you actually see here in the background is actually taken from this particular protest, right? You see all these college students hanging out of windows, standing on the balconies, and all kinds of stuff, right? Just taking over the university altogether. And this is not an isolated incident either, right? You start to see this happen more and more, again, all over the country, at Harvard, Cornell, San Francisco State, again, all over the country. And the radicals themselves end up dismissing most of the really ineffective methods of protest that have been used in the past, primarily because the silent forms of protest, the peaceful forms, are rooted in many cases in white privilege. Okay? These students believe that they're being listened to only because they're white. Okay? But if you actually engage in a much more vocalized and in some cases violent protest, it gets the message across a lot quicker, and people are more willing to actually do something about it. In June of 1969, once the Vietnam War is continuing to escalate, now that we're getting to the end of the 1960s, the Revolutionary Youth Movement begins. Okay, and this begins to distribute a paper with a poem on it. It's actually song lyrics at the Chicago SDS convention that says, "You don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows." Okay. And this group begins to identify itself as weathermen, right? The members of the Revolutionary Youth Movement, which is a much more violent form of the free speech movement, begin to advocate for a white fighting force to basically join forces with the Black Panthers. And their whole goal here is to achieve what they call world communism. Okay, so it's again very much a radical movement here. Okay, we have a very the Black Panthers themselves are very extreme. They have very, ethnocentric ideas, and Weathermen themselves are supposed to be kind of like this white punk version of that. So the fact that the two of them would even be willing to join forces in all this is kind of radical in and of itself, but each one by itself is rather extreme anyway. So, and the whole idea of achieving world communism in the eyes of the new left is a good thing, right? It's not necessarily, in the eyes of the older generation, obviously communism is a very dangerous thing. And if it is allowed to spread all over the country, we could have lawlessness and a revolution to take over the government and all this kind of stuff. It's all of the worst fears of the older generation. But with this new generation, it's something positive. But in October, this group called the Weather Underground, now that they begun to adopt this idea of being the quote-unquote weathermen, they end up attacking the Chicago police force and end up trashing the city. Okay, so it leads to widespread riots, and from September of 1969 all the way up until May of 1970, it's referred to as the Days of Rage. Okay, that's an entire several month-long series of riots, protests, vandalism. There's several hundred bombings of draft board offices. ROTC buildings are attacked and defaced. Federal government facilities, corporate headquarters. It is chaos for the next several months of the 1960s. So again, this is really when the people of the United States, and specifically the younger generation, have completely lost all respect and all trust for the federal government. Okay, and even state and local governments are attacked in the midst of all this too. So it's no wonder why the 1960s are considered to be such a massive decade of social disturbance and social uprising. Okay, there's just this large of a movement all across the country. Now, on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, when it comes to young people-led protest movements, the counterculture movement is far and away a completely different animal. Okay, 1968 is kind of pointed to as the precipitating year for the counterculture movement to really begin in the United States, because again, now that we see the assassination of Martin Luther King, of Robert Kennedy, and again, all of the other major pillars of society during this particular time period, and even Kennedy 5 years before that, and so forth, most of the young people in the United States become very, very disillusioned with this whole idea of politics anyway. Okay, and those who end up losing interest in it end up, quote unquote, dropping out of society and joining the counterculture movement. Okay, so people who are completely disillusioned by the world that they live in and the world of their parents end up joining the counterculture movement. And the counterculture movement is considered to be basically just a large blob, amorphous blob, I guess you could say, of rebellion against any kind of mainstream values, institutions, and social behaviors. Okay, that's the most generic definition that can really be given to this. Okay, there's not really a uniform set of principles that goes along with the counterculture movement. The only real uniting factor to it is the fact that the people who do join it end up being focused on cultural change more so than political activism. So they're trying to change the way they look, the way they act, what they believe in, perhaps, and what they engage in. So it's everything short of politics, right? Politics typically doesn't factor into it that much. And of course, the most common term that's used to refer to people who are movements or members of the counterculture movement is hippies. Okay, and again, hippies are the ones who end up completely dropping out of mainstream society. Right? They have no interest in politics. They have no interest, perhaps, in education, or if they do, they take a very different route with it. Okay, so they're interested in changing their outlook on society and everything, but not changing politics. And the whole I guess common phrase in all this is to do your own thing. Okay, right? Do basically what your parents have told you not to do, what society has told you not to do, whatever it is that makes you happy and comfortable. Okay, so and there's again all kinds of stereotypical images that go along with the hippie movement, right? The whole peace, love, and harmony ideas, right? Trying to get away from war. Rock music becomes a major feature of the 1960s, as we all well know by now. Several mystical religions start to pop back into place. So Hinduism, Buddhism, neo-pagan movements all get a really big comeback during the 1960s. A lot of Eastern religions begin to be imported into the United States. Mind-altering drugs, of course, are a big part of this, right? Marijuana and LSD being the two most famous ones from the time period. There is a major sexual revolution where casual sex is, considered a prime feature of the hippie movement, and the idea of communal living as well. Okay, so basically living as a group in peace somehow. Whether it's an interracial group, intersexual group, whatever the case may be, right? All living together and proving that peace can be achieved. Okay, it's done on a small scale in most cases, and once it starts to get into a larger scale, it becomes a little bit more unstable. Okay, and most of the people who are involved in the hippie movement tend to be middle-class white Americans. Okay, and most of them are teenagers, right? They're alienated by the Vietnam War, by the political stream that the country is going toward, by widespread racism that's continuing in the country, political corruption that we're seeing at the highest levels, and of course their own parental authority. Okay, so in many cases, people can look at the counterculture movement as being a lot of privileged, young white people who are really just dropping out of society, potentially out of laziness, if you want to make that argument, potentially just out of, just complete disillusionment with everything. Some people do it because they feel they have no alternative. They don't feel like there's an avenue that really supports what they believe in life. So it's kind of a take from it what you will kind of situation here. Okay, there's several different avenues that can go into this. And again, illegal drugs are one of the biggest features of the counterculture movement, and this is the time period that really popularizes that in the United States. Marijuana had been outlawed in the United States since 1935 by this point, mainly because of the associations, racial associations. Okay, the United States government, when it really begins this unofficial war on drugs, with the prohibition movement, even, it ends up kind of taking by proxy this idea that marijuana is associated with African American stereotypes and all this kind of stuff, and that somehow it's going to cause interracial relationships to ensue and all this. There's an entire history that goes along with this. So once we get into the 60s, it becomes much more of a popularized drug. And of course, we start to see much more mind-altering substances that are actually fostered at some of the university level. Okay, and this is where you get popular individuals like Timothy Leary. Okay, he was a former Harvard psych professor who actually became the most popular advocate for LSD use in the United States. And LSD is a synthetic drug. It's actually it's lysergic acid is what I believe the long term of it is, but it's a chemical compound that's basically put together, and of course, if you ingest some of this, it actually leads to long term hallucinations that can actually alter the chemical makeup of your brain. Right, it can change your personality in some cases. It can cause you to have dramatic visions. It can cause in some cases, if you have an unstable brain, there is rumors that it can actually lead to insanity if you're not careful. So there's all kinds of rumors and so forth that go along with this. But again, with the implementation of rock music, acid rock, right, mind-altering drugs, and mystical religions, that kind of trifecta ends up leading to brand new precedents for society, for better or for worse. In April of 1967, there's a planned peace march in New York City that ends up attracting 300,000 participants and ends up kickstarting what's referred to as the Summer of Love. Right, this is really the height of the hippie movement in the United States, and upstate New York eventually ends up leading to the Woodstock Festival, and San Francisco, of course, kind of becomes hippie central. Okay. And the Council of the Summer of Love is something that's planned for a gathering in San Francisco at the same time. Right, 100,000 hippies plan to converge on San Francisco for this little council and so forth. And it's supposed to be this major grassroots revolution, quote unquote, to oppose the war in Vietnam, simply by celebrating alternative lifestyles, saying that the way that the people in Vietnam are trying to exist is perfectly acceptable to the counterculture movement. So why is everybody making a big deal about it? Okay. My favorite part about this all, though, is that the Council of the Summer of Love, once everybody gets there, they basically get high and forget while they're there. They forget why they came in the first place. And so it ends up just kind of becoming just a large festival more than anything else. So nothing really ever gets done, and there's not really a whole lot of centralized leadership within the counterculture movement. So it's just kind of becomes a semi-permanent fixture of American life from this point going forward. And as I said before, this ends up leading into all kinds of other new and bizarre ways that people begin to look at life in America. In 1967, during the Summer of Love, you have two guys named Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman, who are basically political satirists, and they get together and they organize a group that they refer to as the Youth International Party, or the Yippies, right? YIP, Yip. Okay. They organize themselves in New York City, and their goal is to basically create a decentralized anarchic nation that's rooted specifically in hippie values. So basically, get rid of the government altogether, and everybody just does what they want. Okay, so again, in the mind of a teenage hippie, this sounds great, right? It sounds like you're getting rid of all parental authority, all social and governmental authority. Obviously, if you look at this from the outside, right, it's not something that can be sustained, but it's might sound great if you're getting high with your friends or something. And these guys refer to themselves as Groucho Marxists, right? They say that they're going to mock capitalism as much as they can, mock consumer culture as much as they can, and they do it primarily through not only satire but pranks as well. So they'll actually attend a political rally and they'll throw a pie in a politician's face. At one point, they nominate a pig for president, to run in the Yippie Party or whatever. And even in 1968, they actually threatened to put LSD into the water supply of the city of Chicago during the Democratic National Convention. So you can imagine how that might have gone. Okay, so but I mean, they're not really considered so much a terrorist group because they can't really be taken very seriously. They're not really threatening armed insurgency or violence or anything. They're a nuisance, right, to mainstream culture and everything. Hippie communes also become a very popular type of living situation in hippie culture themselves. And again, like I said before, this is really just a way for several different hippie groups to come together and try to live as a collective group one way or another, right? Successfully or unsuccessfully. Okay. And there's all kinds of little areas in the country that become kind of these hippie hotspots. So in San Francisco, it's Haight-Ashbury. In New York City, it's Greenwich Village. Chicago, it's the Uptown region. And Atlanta, Georgia, it's 14th Street. Okay, so each major city kind of has its own little hippie area of town. And the other part of communes, too, is that a lot of cases they end up going into rural areas. Okay, there's kind of this quote-unquote back to the land movement, right? Which, again, in some cases couples with the more mystical religions. The neo-pagan movements in particular foster a very nature-oriented religion, in some cases that causes people to try to, shun popular technology and so forth and kind of go back to this, kind of a primitive lifestyle. Problem with this, though, is most of the people who do get involved with this, if they do come from, white, privileged suburban areas, they know absolutely nothing about, homesteading. They know nothing about, cultivating land or anything like that. So in most cases, it ends up becoming kind of an impoverished camp-like situation more than anything else. So it doesn't quite have the, I guess, the utopian image that tends to go along with it in people's minds. And of course, probably the most famous singular event during the hippie movement is the Woodstock Festival in upstate New York. Okay, it takes place from August 15th to the 18th of 1969. Okay, again, most famous open-air music festival of the 1960s. Okay. And it's a massive event. There's 400,000 hippies that end up converging on this 600-acre farm near Bethel in upstate New York. And it's again, it's a 3-4 day festival where people get together and just engage in just about everything you can imagine. Okay, there's an entire documentary series about Woodstock that basically it takes a very deep dive. I mean, you see exactly what's happening on the ground. People are taking drugs, people are making love, people are having fights, all kinds of stuff is going on. And of course, this is the crowning movement for several different major rock musicians of the 1960s. So people like Jimi Hendrix perform, Janis Joplin, Joe Cocker, Joan Baez, all end up headlining this event. Okay, and this is really what puts Jimi Hendrix in particular on the map. He and Janis Joplin both just rocket to stardom after this. And of course, there's other major rock groups as well that become famous after this, right? The Who, Jefferson Airplane, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Santana, right? They all have these major roles in this particular musical event. And again, it's kind of the 1960s rock dream concert, if you could imagine it ever happening that way. And we don't see its like ever again, really, essentially after this. Now, when it comes to other forms of protest during this time period, feminism also starts to gain a lot of traction during the 1960s, leading into the 70s. We've already seen first wave feminism come through from the 1800s into the early 1900s, and first wave feminism was really primarily geared to the idea of women gaining the right to vote. Okay, and by 1920, of course, that is actually achieved. Right, women managed to actually gain the right to vote via the 19th Amendment, and it seems like first wave feminism has been a large scale success. Second wave feminism, which we start to see in the 1960s leading into the 70s, becomes much more socially driven and takes a much more critical look at women's roles in society. Okay, so it's very anti-domestic, right? And they begin to look specifically at equal workplace treatment. Okay, so and this has to do with equal wages, equal treatment under the law, and so forth. So it ends up kind of going along in some cases with some of the other equal rights amendments and so forth, the civil rights amendments that we start to see in the mid 1960s. And not all the goals are met, unfortunately. So the Equal Pay Act of 1963 states that it is illegal to pay women less than men for the same job. Okay. Unfortunately, though, women are still paid about 42% less than men during this time period, even with the Equal Pay Act. So this is, again, another one of those federal laws that doesn't really have a whole lot of teeth behind it, right? It doesn't have a whole lot of enforcement to go along with it. One of the most popular writers of the time period who really begins to revolutionize the way women view themselves and the rest of society is Betty Friedan. Okay, she writes, she becomes the leader of the women's movement in the United States, and she writes a book called The Feminine Mystique in 1963. And this specifically criticizes the idea of the cult of domesticity, right? This whole movement that we've seen, again, during the 1940s and 50s of women as kind of the happy homemakers, the good mothers, the good wives, and so forth. And of course, advertising and everything during this time period is primarily geared toward women, and it constantly portrays women in a very submissive role, right? Bringing their husbands, food or a beer or their slippers or a newspaper or whatever, quite often on their hands and knees. Okay, and so at this point in time, women like Betty Friedan look at this and they say that is absolutely not the reality, right? That's not what we want to be looked at, right? That's not how we want to be viewed. And the other thing about the feminine mystique that Betty Friedan points out too is the idea that if women are being put into this submissive stereotypical role, it's because men are the ones who are doing it. Men are the ones who are perpetrating it. So if we want to change this, women are going to have to stand up and speak up and say that we don't want to be treated this way anymore. Okay, so it's very much a pushback against the male chauvinistic society of the time. And by the time we get to 1966, there is a group that forms called the National Organization for Women. Okay, and they have several different features that are attached to kind of this forward-moving women's movement now. So the ending of gender discrimination in the workplace is one major thing. Legalization of abortion becomes a key talking point, especially once we get into the 70s. And the establishment of federal and state support for child care centers, okay, trying to actually, bring something back that was actually in existence when Franklin Roosevelt was president. And it's worth mentioning, too, that by 1970, there's still only one woman in the U.S. Senate. Okay, we have Margaret Smith representing Maine as the only female state senator in the entire country. Okay, so this is another thing that people begin to look at as subject for change, right? And as we get into the 70s and especially into the 80s, we start to see more and more female representatives in politics. 1972, we have the introduction of Title IX. And Title IX, of course, if you are a college student or if you have a job working for a federal or a local government or something like that, typically you have to take a Title IX training session or seminar of some kind, to qualify in order to continue with this. Title IX bars all sexual discrimination in education and federally funded programs. Okay, and it brings into light the ideas of any kind of sexual assault rules, anything that goes along with rape allegations, and child care and child rearing has become another feature of it recently as well. So Title IX is very, very focused on individual rights and individual experiences in these places, making sure that the law is actually being obeyed and that people's rights are being protected. And Title IX ends up allowing more and more female participation in high school sports. It increases by about 10 times what it was before. So you start to see more and more women's teams, being brought out, being funded. It ends up doubling at the college level as well. So again, in areas that have been, again, quote unquote, traditionally occupied by males, we start to see more and more female participation now. Okay, because women have a right to do it as well. And there is a further equal rights amendment that is planned for the year 1973, but it doesn't ever really pass. Okay, and it's worth mentioning too that this particular amendment is something that has constantly been introduced and reintroduced since 1973 and has never fully been acknowledged or approved by all states. Okay, all the necessary numbers of states. Okay. So well into the late 70s and the early 80s, there's another round of it, and even continuing now into the 21st century, there's still a lot of pushback, especially among conservatives, for an equal rights amendment to be passed. The biggest case when it comes to new wave feminism that occurs, especially in the 1970s, is Roe v. Wade. Okay. And it surrounds a young woman named Norma McCorvey, who you see here, and her protected name in this particular court case is given as Jane Roe. This is where we get the Roe in Roe v. Wade. She is denied an abortion in Texas without a rape charge. Okay. Now, during this particular time period, it's worth noting that in Texas, and this is specifically in Dallas County, if a young woman becomes pregnant by any other means besides rape, she is required by law to carry the pregnancy to full term. Okay? But if she is raped, and if a rape charge is actually obtained, okay, that's the kind of the second stage of this. A woman can be raped, but unless an actual conviction is achieved, right, and the criminal, the rapist himself, is actually, found and charged guilty in all this, right, that's really the only thing that's going to allow her to achieve an abortion. Okay, in other words, she can't have an abortion just because she chooses to have one. Okay, so there's a male-dominated law in place that prevents this from happening, and so this law is actually brought up into the Dallas County DA's office. Okay, Henry Wade, who is the DA, a suit is brought against him. Okay, and he is actually the man who prosecuted Jack Ruby, the man who assassinated Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, so Norma McCorvey as Jane Roe files a suit against Henry Wade here. So this is how we get Roe v. Wade. Okay. And the Supreme Court ends up getting involved, and they end up striking down the state law that says that abortions are forbidden during the first 3 months of pregnancy. Okay, so this is what allows Roe v. Wade to actually be legalized in the country. Okay, so abortion is legalized in states during the first 3 months of pregnancy. It is allowed. Okay, and so there's still constantly back and forth combat over this entire principle, again, well into the 21st century now. And this idea of something referred to as a right to choose is something that is acknowledged for women's health and well-being. Okay, so, and it's not, it can't be male-driven in that particular regard, is what the major argument states. That, a woman's right to choose what happens to her own body should be her right and her right alone, right? Whether she wants to have children or not, whatever the circumstances may be. And of course, as you can imagine, there is a major conservative backlash over this, okay, and specifically among Roman Catholics and evangelical Protestants. Okay, there's a religious faction that ends up pushing back majorly against this, and this is where we get the corollary to right to choose, and that is the right to life groups that begin to assert a much more conservative stance on this, continuing into the 1970s and especially into the 80s. And of course, well into the 21st century as well. Now, radical feminism is a much more extremist branch of the new women's rights movements that began in the 1960s and 70s. Okay, and radical feminism really starts to gain traction in the late 60s. Okay, with a group that refers to itself as the Women's Liberation Movement. Sometimes it's shortened to Women's Lib. And of course, this is a much more militant form of feminism. Okay, these are women who have not only been fed up with everything that's happened, but they are willing to get out and actually physically protest against all this. Okay, many of them are civil rights protester veterans. Many of them are war protest veterans, so they have had a lot of experience with this. They've dealt with men face to face. They pushed back already on many other issues, and they know what works and what does not. And most of the time, they are united by a common problem or a common goal, simply by virtue of the fact that most of them are women, okay, living in a quote-unquote man's world. Okay, most of the laws, most of the government principles and regulations and so forth are all written and monitored by men. Okay, and they basically are asserting that women need to have a greater voice in all this so that it is actually equal. Okay. Robin Morgan begins the American women's movement in the United States. She writes a book called Sisterhood is Powerful, and her book basically states that women are united under a common history as women, right? That they have faced not only decades but centuries of gender discrimination in one form or another, and she basically just brings all that to the forefront, right? Magnifies it. Susan Brown Miller, who's a journalist, actually writes a very, very important book during this time period called Against Our Will, and she brings to light the fact that the criteria that exist in the United States for rape, when it comes to rape allegations, rape charges, whatever criteria the law recognizes, it's all male-driven. Okay, and that women have not had any kind of an input into what the definition of rape actually is. Okay, and she says because of that, by virtue of that particular fact, men have used their own criteria for rape as a form of oppression against women. Okay, and so she says that we need to actually have our own input into this since we are the ones who are directly affected by it. Okay. So, after she starts to get involved with this, it actually ends up changing the way that the United States ends up defining rape in criminal terms. And radical feminism are actually more interested in social transformation more so than equality. Okay, they don't just want the same rights that men do. They want society to actually look at women differently than they have before. Again, don't just keep looking at them as a tool for reproduction or an object of sexual desire or as a happy homemaker or anything like that. They don't want to stay in the role that society has given them, right? They want to break away from that. And so they began teaching women's history classes in schools and colleges. They go so far as to do things like picket the 1968 Miss America pageant as something that is, something that objectifies women. And they go so far as to burn men's magazines like Playboy. They burn bras and high heels and what they refer to as freedom cans, right? They're basically oil drums that are trash cans where they burn these types of things. And primarily because these forms of women's fashion, these forms of entertainment that are geared toward men, all of it is basically been done to make women more appealing to men in one form or another. Okay. And even bras themselves were actually invented by men, right? In fact, Howard Hughes, the man who revolutionized the aircraft industry, had a major part to play in the invention and design of bras. And they form all kinds of militant organizations during the time period, regional ones, district ones, state-based ones, each with its own specific goals. My favorite one of the group is Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell. Okay, and again, just a group that is basically out to create as much social discord and to make men feel as uncomfortable as they possibly can. Right? They hold all kinds of protest movements. Again, these are the women that burn things in trash cans and so forth. RAP is another group, Women's Radical Action Project, the Keep On Truckin' Sisters, and the Red Stockings, right? Women who refer to themselves as uppity women. Okay, they begin to kind of band together under a common slogan and use what is potentially considered an insult to their own advantage. Right, they embrace it. And on August 26, 1970, on the 50th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, the Women's Strike for Equality happens. It's a march for gender equality that occurs. I can't remember. I believe it's in either New York City or Washington, D.C. I forget which. But it's a major milestone moment for women in the United States, right? To prove that that they're not going anywhere. And like many of the protest movements of the 1960s and 70s, there is a fracture that ends up occurring here as well. Okay, and by the late 70s, the women's movement in particular starts to divide in the same way that the civil rights movement divides. Okay, just like we saw with the division between individuals like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, right, in different methods of achieving the same goal, feminism ends up doing the same thing. Okay. One of the major criticisms that is actually attached to the feminist movement is the fact that it doesn't really broaden that much beyond the white middle class. Okay, so women who are involved in it, who are minorities, who are African Americans, who are Latino women, and so forth, end up getting kind of marginalized from the group because, again, most of these movements take place in kind of either in suburban areas and then are moved to major cities, or they have or women are actually searching for specific rights that have to do with workplaces where minority women are typically not even hired. Okay, so there's a disconnect in one form or another that ends up happening here. And again, the ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment is something that constantly stalls time and time and time again until its ostensible death in 1982. Okay, so there's a constant pushback from conservative society the further along we get in the 70s and into the 80s before the Equal Rights Amendment is actually shot down. Essentially once and for all, but there's a constant movement to try to bring it back, even now in the 21st century. And there are a few successes that feminism does have under its belt here, okay? It does manage to bring more attention to poverty-stricken women, okay? It's estimated by 1970, for instance, that 36% of all poor families in the United States are headed by women, okay? These are single mothers who are raising, in some cases, multiple children on their own, in some cases in inner cities where, there is very little housing authority, right, where they're actually being marginalized more, in some cases by their ethnicity or whatever the case may be. They're not able to get jobs, they're being paid less than men, right? There's all kinds of factors involved here. And again, the focus on gender discrimination in the workplace, right? The Title IX in particular, among others, these are the kinds of laws that the feminist movement is trying to put into effect more and more. And by 1976, it's estimated that over 50% of married women are employed outside of the home, and 9/10 of them are college graduates. Equal pay for equal work is something that is mostly achieved. Again, I stress the word mostly here because even still in the 21st century, women are paid, roughly, 8 cents on the dollar or 7 cents on the dollar in some cases, or to what men are, right? Or 70 cents or 80 cents on the dollar. Sorry, not a mathematician. So 70 or 80% of what men get paid is what women typically get paid, even still. And equal employment opportunities for women is something that is, ostensibly granted by the Equal Rights Amendment of 1964, right? Something that it's an equal opportunity employment system, ideally. By 1960, it's estimated 38% of women are working outside the home, and by 1980, that number jumps all the way up to 52%. So women are gaining more and more independence and autonomy in American society, and they're basically saying we need the government to get on board with this and actually support us as this happens. And there is more availability when it comes to high-quality government-subsidized child care centers. Again, even today in the 21st century, it's not a full, widespread reality all over the place. You still have to pay for child care out of pocket in most cases. And again, now that society has begun to focus more on women and, again, on children as well, since the baby boomer generation came along, the statistics when it comes to children and poor children in particular begins to come to the forefront. So we have nearly 3 million poor children when compared to the ratio of only about 530,000 open daycare slots in the U.S. So the number of children compared to the number of daycare slots, again, there's a massive discrepancy there. And again, women gaining easier access to prenatal care and family planning. Again, we have Planned Parenthood, who's been in existence since the 1920s, and again, the birth control and so forth. And now that Roe v. Wade has come along, right, these two things are actually beginning to become a little bit more commonplace. There are certain improvements when it comes to divorce laws as well. So women are given custody of their children in many cases. If they have abusive husbands, they can actually get away from them easier. So there's all kinds of factors, again, that go along with this. And again, the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s is something that has been somewhat of an undercurrent in all this as well. In 1960, for instance, the FDA begins approving the birth control pill for public use. And we started to see this even in as early as the 1920s, but it was on a case-by-case basis. It wasn't FDA approved at the time, but now we get to the 60s, right, the government actually says yes to this for the first time. And the number of women engaging in premarital sex in the United States from 1960 to 75 statistically is up by about 50%. So again, this seems like a greater motivation for the government to get on board here. And by 1990, as a direct result of birth control in terms of, at least one generation or even potentially two generations removed here, by 1990 it's estimated that there are 400 million fewer people in the world as a direct result of birth control, right? So it's ending up with the population end up, balancing out a little bit more. Now, some of the other movements that we start to see when it comes to ethnic groups in particular includes the Hispanic rights movement. Okay? After the year 1945, the term Hispanic is utilized more and more when it comes to discussing economic and social justice issues. Okay? Again, remember, as early as the 1920s and even into the 1930s in some cases, the census didn't even designate between white and Hispanic or Latino when it came to dividing ethnicities among, right? We actually had them all lumped together. So the further along we get and the bigger the presence of Hispanic communities in the United States, the more attention they're going to get. Okay. And when it comes to the terms themselves, okay, it's an important distinction to actually look at here, is the term Hispanic in particular refers to individuals who trace their ancestry to either Spanish-speaking Latin America or Spain itself. Okay, so it's a little bit of a wider ranging term. When it comes to the term Latino, Latina, or Latinx, as we sometimes hear as a neutral term, this term refers specifically to individuals who are of Latin American descent, right, who come from Mexico, somewhere in Central America, and even in South America. Okay, so it's more specific to the Western Hemisphere in this case. During World War II, we start to see a much larger labor shortage in the United States. Okay, we had a few people who began to move north from the southern portion of the United States. They leave a lot of the agricultural sector with no one to work it, and so we start to see a greater influx of Hispanic Americans into the United States. Okay, through the Bracero program and even as undocumented immigrants. And as this population begins to increase in the U.S., there's an increased desire for equal rights. By the year 1960, it's estimated that the median income for a Mexican-American family is only about 62% of what the national average is. Okay, so again, very similar to what we see when it comes to the African-American community in the South during this time period, right? Same type of discrepancy. And undocumented immigration is probably the biggest setback when it comes to Hispanic civil rights because the contingency of white America tries to make the argument that if you are not a citizen of the United States, then you are not going to be granted rights of any kind. You are not going to be granted civil rights because you are not a citizen. So this is a large hurdle for a lot of immigrants who are coming to the United States. And if they can't get in documented, right, through some kind of stumbling block in the process, if it's institutionalized racism, if it's some kind of a literacy test that they know cannot be passed, or whatever the case may be, right? It seems like undocumented immigration may be the only alternative. And Mexican laborers who are members of the Bracero program become another issue. Okay, this is something where the government is directly corresponding with the Mexican government to allow a certain number of Mexican immigrants to come to the United States every year and receive sponsorship of some kind. Okay, to actually get room and board and food, right, as they work for a year-long contract and then return home. By 1962, we get the United Farm Workers Cooperative that's co-founded by Cesar Chavez. Okay? And Chavez becomes the primary figure of the Hispanic rights movement of the 1960s. Okay? He is the son of Mexican immigrants, and he is also a World War II veteran. He served in the U.S. Navy. And most of his movement relies, again, on college student volunteers. Again, this is one of the major features of these movements in the 60s. And he has a very, very strong alliance with organized labor, primarily because most of the people who are, of course, involved in this are members of the working class, right? They are involved in some kind of organized labor or another, or they are trying to organize. And the thing that makes him so pronounced in all this is, as a leader, he lives a self-imposed life of poverty, right? He's not above sleeping in a ditch, eating on the side of the road, right? Whatever can be found, right? He doesn't elevate himself to being detached from the whole movement, in other words. He is actually on the ground, on the front lines with all the other individuals involved. One of his partners in all this is Dolores Huerta. She is one of the co-founders of the UFW, and specifically they found the UFW when it comes to migrant lettuce workers and grape pickers. These are the two primary industries where workers' rights are being infringed upon. And many of the workers who are involved in all these are undocumented workers. Okay, so again, it seems like it's a way for the white contingency, who is really kind of the head of these organizations, to take advantage of the workers. And they end up organizing several nonviolent protest marches. In some cases, they organize hunger strikes to try to bring national attention to what's going on. They organize boycotts to where people, bringing awareness to the fact of what these corporations are doing and telling people not to buy their products. And by September of 1965, United Farm Workers organizes its biggest strike against a corporate grape growing organization in California's San Joaquin Valley. And this is primarily to gain better pay and benefits for the migrant workers who are involved, again, many of whom are undocumented. And the biggest thing that works in favor of the Hispanic rights movement is the fact that there is a major explosion in the Hispanic population in the United States after World War II. Okay? Again, some of that has to do with the fact of kind of a bleed over from the Great Depression, where there is actually a need for migrant workers. And again, as the war continues on, more soldiers have gone off to fight, and few come home. We end up with a little bit of a vacuum in the United States. So this ends up filling that vacuum and growing over time. By 1970, it's estimated there are 9 million Hispanics in America. It's about 4.8%. By the year 2000, the number jumps to 35 million, okay, so about 12.5%. And by the year 2015, only about 5 years ago, there are 55 million Hispanics in the United States, okay, and they're considered the largest minority group in America at about 17%, and the number continues to grow. Okay, whether this includes documented or undocumented citizens, it's kind of hard to say. Another group that actually gains a lot of attention during the time and over time has kind of shrunken back a little bit more is the Native American movement. Okay, by the late 1960s, American Indians become a much larger political force in the United States for a number of reasons. For one thing, the element of white guilt has started to come to the forefront more and more, especially when it comes to marginalized groups in the U.S. Native Americans, since the film industry in particular has begun to take off, have been constantly portrayed as the villain, okay, being portrayed as savages, individuals who are out to basically, threaten white culture, threaten white womanhood in some cases. Again, they're constantly portrayed as barbarians in one manner or another. And that, coupled with the fact that Native Americans themselves are pushed into a life of poverty by white Americans in most cases, ends up leading to a large-scale need for Native Americans to gain more rights in the United States. The unemployment rate for Native Americans, for instance, is about 10 times the national rate. Okay? Simply no one is hiring them. And the life expectancy for Native Americans is about 20 years lower than the national average as well. Part of this has to do with alcoholism being something that becomes very rampant among Native Americans, and unfortunately, it's a stereotypical statistic that's attached to them. But that, plus again, just the simple hardship of living and trying to find work constantly, just the stress of life as a Native American in general is enough to cause health problems. And the suicide rate is 100 times higher than that of whites. Okay. Through constant generations of repression leading to depression, which leads to this type of thing end up occurring. So by the 60s, there is finally this need to push back against it more and more. And the movement is referred to as the Red Power movement, right? It says that, these militant protests are primarily aimed at government agencies from the local level all the way up to the chain to the federal level, basically saying that there has been a lack of change since the 19th centuries, right? Since American Indians have been put on reservations for the first time. So in 1968, a group of Chippewa tribesmen from Minneapolis, George Mitchell, Dennis Banks, who you see up here at the top, and Russell Means, who you see at the bottom here, who eventually becomes an actor in the United States, form what is called the American Indian Movement, or AIM. Okay. And the American Indian Movement is a much more militant form of Native American protest in the United States. Okay, they bring back Native American culture. As you can see, they dress in traditional garb to a certain extent. They wear their hair long. They wear the bone bead necklaces, and they arm themselves. They wear the eagle feathers in their hair. They do the whole thing. Okay. From November of 1969 until June of 1961, they actually occupy Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. Okay, Alcatraz had ceased being a prison in 1965 and had become kind of a landmark and museum afterward. And so once they end up occupying it, they take control of the island and they stay there for nearly 2 years. Okay? And it takes Richard Nixon getting into office and cutting all electrical and telephone lines to the island before the government actually comes in and arrests the few who remain. But at its height, there are several hundred of these protesters from all different ethnicities, not just Native Americans, right? Some white, some black, all who end up occupying Alcatraz for a while. In October of 1972, this group actually organizes a march from the West Coast to Washington, D.C. that they refer to as the Trail of Broken Treaties. And this is supposed to raise awareness for the government's broken promises to Native Americans. Again, since the 19th century, okay? We've seen a constant breakdown in discussions, a constant refusal of the federal government to honor its promises to Native Americans when it comes to moving them, when it comes to taking their lands, putting them on reservations, all kinds of horrible things that have been occurring for the better part of a century and a half or more at this point. And the protesters, once they get to Washington, D.C., attempt to meet with Richard Nixon, and he refuses to even entertain the idea. Okay, and so they actually end up occupying the Federal Bureau of Indian Affairs until he actually relents and is willing to renew discussions of grievances with them. Probably the pinnacle moment of this particular movement occurs in 1973 when 200 Sioux members end up occupying the town of Wounded Knee in South Dakota. Okay, and this is an armed insurgency that ends up occurring here. Okay, it stems from, of course, back in the 19th century, Wounded Knee was actually the site of a major massacre by the U.S. Army against Native Americans, the Sioux themselves in particular. And in 1972, there is actually a crime that occurs where local whites end up killing a Sioux, right? And they are actually given very, very minor sentences as a direct result of this. So the members of the American Indian Movement converge on Wounded Knee armed with assault rifles, and they actually end up taking 11 hostages and get into a shootout with the FBI and federal marshals before they actually have to come to an agreement and sign documents, which you see them doing in the background here, to basically call it off. Okay. In the process, one Native American is killed and one is wounded, and the government actually agrees to re-examine Indian treaty rights over time. So it takes a few years before the protesters actually deliver several copies of the old treaties from the 19th century to the federal courts, and manage to use them as a basis for restitution in some cases. So several different tribes in Alaska, in Maine, South Carolina, and Massachusetts all managed to win several substantial settlements as a direct result of this. Okay? Some cases it's tribal rights, recognition of federal grants, and so forth, and sometimes it's monetary compensation. Okay? So there's all kinds of different features to this, but it's kind of it seems in hindsight like a flash in the pan because it doesn't really gain a whole lot of traction thereafter. And finally, the last major movement that we'll talk about in the 1960s is the gay rights movement. Okay, beginning in the 1960s, there is a gradual shift that occurs in the gay community where there is a larger sense of acceptance. Okay, and part of that has to do with the counterculture movement in general, being kind of a group that fosters acceptance among different forms of life, right? Different lifestyles. And in the 1960s too, it's worth noting that this is still a time period where homosexuality is actually viewed as a crime. In some cases, it is prosecuted as under the heading of sexual perversion somehow. And it's also considered to be a mental illness by the American Psychological Association too. So again, there is virtually no widespread acceptance at all for a gay lifestyle during this time period. That begins to change, though, in June of 1969. In New York City, in Greenwich Village, there is a place called the Stonewall Inn, and it's a very prominent gay bar. Okay, and it's noted for being a gay bar, although it's not officially considered on the outside as a gay bar. Okay, it's noted for being a place where people who are gay can come and congregate together. Right. Someone tips off the New York City Vice Squad to actually send a raid to the Stonewall Inn and try to arrest everybody who's there, okay, on the grounds of, again, sexual perversion and any other list of trumped-up charges you can come up with. Instead of dispersing, though, when the police actually arrive, the patrons of the bar actually get into an altercation with the police and fight back. Okay, so they end up actually pushing back against a lot of the stereotypes that people considered at the time period, that these are people who are passive, they're not going to fight back, we'll just arrest them all and get them off the streets, etc. And so not only do the patrons themselves get involved, but several hundreds of supporters actually show up and join in on the riots. And it becomes referred to as the Stonewall riots. Okay, unfortunately, the major event that ends up being the climax is that the Stonewall Inn ends up burning down. Okay, but the aftermath of that is, from the ashes of it comes the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activist Alliance. Okay, so we now actually have a full-fledged movement for gay rights in the United States. And the whole goal here, of course, is to end all discrimination against gay and transgender people, right, who still actually have a presence in society at this point, okay? Not a lot of attention is given to it for obvious reasons, right, because this is still the time period where if you do give attention to it, you invite the wrath of the police. And the terms heterosexual and homosexual become almost pejorative terms in the gay community. Okay, they're deemed as an imposed term, that they're sexist, that they're very clinical. And again, the terms heterosexual and homosexual are used by the American Psychological Association to determine healthy and sick, quote unquote. And so by 1973, this ends up massively inflating to where we have over 800 gay organizations all across the country. Okay. The American Psychiatric Association finally removes the term from its manual of mental illnesses, so it recognizes it as an actual lifestyle and not as an illness of some kind. Okay. Major movement by doing that. And colleges and universities even go so far as to begin offering courses and even majors in gay studies, okay, sometimes called queer studies. And some groups even began petitioning the government very early on to recognize same-sex marriage. Okay, we don't actually see this come to full fruition until we get to the 21st century. And unfortunately, it gets mired down in a lot of the conservative backlash that occurs in the 1970s and well into the 80s, and even in some cases into the 90s and the early 2000s.